Okay. Well, thank you, Annie, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here at the Linen Hall Library. What a stunning place it is, and how lucky we are. We have such a beautiful old building with its interesting history. And thank you all for coming. It's lovely to be with you today. Okay. So, we've got quite a lot to get through. If this, I'm going to give a presentation on my research. I'm going to do a couple of short readings from my novel, and then if there's time for a couple of questions, we'll go through it. Okay. Let me take you back in time. On Thursday, the 19th of April, in the year 1621, Elizabeth Sawyer was hanged at Tyburn Gallows on London's Oxford Street for witchcraft. Elizabeth was the mother of 11 children. She was 49 years old, a woodsman's daughter from the parish in Middlesex. Okay, our next character. Henry Goodcole was the chaplain in Newgate Prison where Elizabeth was held before her execution. He spent time with her in jail and published a pamphlet on her. The title of his pamphlet is The Wonderful Discovery of Elizabeth Sawyer. In it, he claims to show how God's providence uncovered Sawyer's evil ways. And this is actually one of the last two remaining copies of the pamphlet. I photographed this in the British Library. It's a tiny wee thing. Goodcole's publication had hardly left the press when it was snapped up by three playwrights, Decker, Ford, and Rowley, who used it to pen the tragicomedy, The Witch of Edmonton. The play was first performed on the Jacobean stage at the Cockpit Theatre on the 27th of December, 1621. It was performed last year, and it is still performed all around the world. My novel borrows Goodcole's title, and I, with this book, very much wanted to turn his meaning on its head, and he is one of the chief characters in the book. But how to write a book like this? Because all the evidence that we have comes from Goodcole. And Goodcole, who is a lay preacher, who published a lot of pamphlets on a lot of different prisoners in Newgate Prison, had his own agenda. Now, I lived in Edmonton, where Elizabeth Sawyer lived her life. It's where my daughter Elspeth was born 30 years ago. And I felt sure that there must be a way of finding more about Sawyer while avoiding the pitfalls of Goodcole's pamphlet. And to do that, I was helped greatly by the Edmonton Historical Society. So let's find out where Edmonton is. Edmonton is a group of parishes 8 miles north of London. And this is the first of our maps. To research the story, what I did was to look at maps and police reports and other documents produced during Elizabeth Sawyer's lifetime. This is a map made when she was in her 20s. And we can see London there. And if we were to go around the Isle of Dogs to Blackwall and then go up the River Lee for 8 miles, we find Edmonton here, and Winchmore, where Elizabeth Sawyer lived, up there. Okay. Now, before I dip into more maps and my research, I want to talk a little bit or ask a few questions about Edmonton. Okay, let's go on to this scary piece of evidence. Okay, was Edmonton a notable centre for witchcraft in the 1620s or for witchcraft accusations? The answer to that is it was quite average. The particular form of witchcraft we're talking about, or the notions of witchcraft, is very much related to the post-Reformation English context. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. Now, this is actually a map of Essex, which is the neighbouring county. If you cross the River Lee that we saw, you come to Essex. And Edmonton is actually at the nexus between three counties, where Middlesex, Essex, and Hertfordshire join. And the figures for Essex are really startling. They're about 3 times the average for counties. And there's a particular reason for this, which I'm going to come on to. But Edmonton, which is down here marked in red, it's about average. It's not to say that there weren't a lot of cases, there were, but nothing compared to Essex. So if we go and think of the year 1621, when Elizabeth was tried at the Old Bailey, was that a particular year when a lot of prosecutions took place? So if we go to, this is part of the same study published by Macfarlane in the 1970s. This is a really interesting graph. Again, it relates to Essex, a few miles away from where Elizabeth Sawyer lived, but across the county bounds. And we see really there are two great peaks. One is in the 1580s, a time of social, a time of instability, the Babington plot, the Armada in 1588. But by far the greatest peak is in the English Civil War, where it literally does go off the graph. So the graph goes up to 40 and the peak there goes up to 50 prosecutions. So these are guilty verdicts. So it's time really we discussed what was witchcraft in early modern England. And what we discover are really there are two stages to witchcraft accusations. At parish level, the original accusations often resulted from quarrels, petty quarrels, neighbours falling out with each other, lack of trust, a breakdown in community relations. But the second stage, which is really important, these complaints often were transformed when the judiciary got involved, members of the law, justice of the peace. So when these issues came to court, when these complaints came to court, there's a decisive moment as to whether the kind of male literate elite take them seriously. And the reason those figures in Essex are 3 times higher than accusations, guilty verdicts in Kent or Middlesex or wherever else is because law officers took an interest in finding witches. People were making their reputations by convicting witches. Okay, so that two-stage process is really important because one of the things we're looking at in this talk is the vulnerability of ordinary women in early modern England. Okay, so I want to refer to the academic Deborah Willis, she's basically going to formally say what I just said, who writes, quote, "Village level quarrels that led to witchcraft accusations often grew out of struggles to control household boundaries, feeding, childcare, and other matters typically assigned to the women's sphere. As a quarrel escalated, the younger woman, and it often was a younger woman, conferred upon the older one the attributes of an invasive and malevolent mother. Willis then articulates a further process which transformed such accusations once they reached a justice of the peace. In elite discourse, influenced by Calvinist doctrine and continental theories of the demonic pact, she, the witch, is subordinated to a diabolic male master, becoming the servant or drudge of the devil, now represented as a rival to God and the adult fathers who rule his name." So that's the kind of patriarchal stage, if you like. And if we look at the actual case of Elizabeth Sawyer, we find that it does fit this pattern. The argument that got Elizabeth Sawyer accused of witchcraft was with a neighbour, and it was over a bar of soap. So really petty quarrel. The neighbour, whose name was Agnes Radcliffe, was round the back of her house. She had a big pail of water. She was doing her washing and she had a paddle and she was stirring it. And Sawyer's pig came along and snapped up the bar of soap which had slipped onto the ground. And Agnes Radcliffe just instinctively picked up the paddle and hit the pig to get it away. And Sawyer came out of her house and pointed at Agnes Radcliffe and said, "That'll be a dear blow to you." And unfortunately for everybody, Agnes Radcliffe fell ill the next day. And when she died of a fever, everybody pointed the finger at Sawyer. And I think it shows that people were afraid of her. Okay, let's carry on with real evidence because, okay, so this is the second of our maps. And this is a map commissioned by this man when Elizabeth Sawyer was a child. And here we see Elizabeth Sawyer's forest. It's called the Lord's Grove. That green area on Lord Burleigh's map is about a square kilometre. And Lord Burleigh, we should say, was the most powerful man in England. He was a man who had bought land in Edmonton. He was Elizabeth I's chief advisor and Lord High Treasurer. The Cecils, and Lord Burleigh is William Cecil, are a consistent theme in the story because they are the most powerful people in Edmonton. And very usefully for me, I mean, this house is still in the hands of the same family, and it's just in the archive in Hatfield House, down in the cellar. So it's extraordinary. For 400 years, it really hasn't moved at all. That's the house where Queen Elizabeth was when she was told she would be queen in 1558. So let's look at it, because this really is Sawyer's world. We have the village of Winchmore, which is this set of buildings here. I appreciate it's very hard for you to see detail, but I'm just going to kind of give you an interpretation of it. Here we have the county boundary, the parish boundary with Enfield, which is the neighbouring parish. And here we see that William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, has written over the map. He's labelled the gates to the next parish, and he's labelled who owns what land. And Burleigh was very painstaking in labelling the maps that he had commissioned. Here, the Catholic family Leake we've got a name crossed out, the Catholic family Leake had gained land. And here, there's a fenced-in area with the word Roth written on it. And that's important because Robert Roth controlled all of this land. And on a local level, he was a rival to Burleigh. So what's going on here? William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, is keeping Roth contained and balancing the interests with other Catholic interests. So the Roths were Puritans. And I would say that this really is a microcosm of early modern England or Elizabethan England, in which the Cecils, first William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and then his son Robert Cecil, who we're about to meet in a moment, control the balance of power and offset the old Catholic gentry with the new Puritan interests. The Roths were an old family, but they were very much Calvinist and part of the new interests that later would claim ascendancy at the time of the Civil War. So my methodology here was, let's see if we can get this to come on. Yep, was to compare that map with one produced when Elizabeth Sawyer was in her 30s. And it's of exactly the same area. And it's produced by Robert Cecil, or it's commissioned by Robert Cecil. And what we see is there's very little change. So that sense of the Cecils holding the balance of power in Elizabethan and then Jacobean England. Okay, let's get closer to Sawyer's story. So this is the church in Edmonton where Elizabeth Sawyer married her husband Edward when she was 19 years old. And here we see the church on one of those maps. And we can see that it has really not changed very much. I took that photograph in 2018, I think. And there it is in 1606, drawn by Robert Cecil's mapmaker. And in the crypt of that church comes the most important piece of evidence that I uncovered in 5 years of research. And this is a transcription of it. This brings us close to the life that Elizabeth Sawyer actually lived. With this document, we move away from reputation, innuendo, dramatic comments on stages. We move to the nitty-gritty of her life. And all the key dates of her life are here, because this is from the Register of Births and Deaths. And we see, what do we see? We see that Elizabeth married her husband, Edward, in December in 1591. We see that she had her first child, Robert, was born, and then another son, Francis, and then something bad happens. because something goes wrong. And what we see is that Elizabeth's eldest daughter, first daughter, dies exactly a year after her baptism on Christmas Day in 1597. And then 5 of her children die in quick succession. So 5 of her children die in 5 years. Then there's a gap of 5 years where there are no baptisms, and then she starts to reuse the same names. And we might well ask, what is going on? And the answer to what is going on is a cost of living crisis, something that we are very familiar with in the present time. And you will find that there are quite a few echoes when we go back 400 years to the present time. So let's look at London bread prices. Here they are. They peaked in 1596, and here we have the death of Sawyer's children. So what has happened is that 4 harvests have failed in a row. It's not really talked about, but the last years of Elizabeth Tudor's reign were very difficult. There was famine, or what would have been called dearth in those days, and there was considerable social unrest. The summers were very wet, the winters were incredibly cold, and the price of flour tripled. London filled up with 10,000 vagrants, Norwich with 2,000. It was a really difficult time. And the Sawyers parish, which is on the London Road, 8 miles north of London, filled up with all of those people coming from Hertfordshire and from Essex and from elsewhere, who were all descending on London, trying to beg, borrow, or steal a meal. So what was the response of the authorities? Well, the most powerful man in England at the time was Robert Cecil, the man who commissioned our second map. And he spoke in Parliament of the lamentable state of the poor, who are like to perish. But Robert Cecil, who is also in charge of James I's surveillance state, the man who foiled the Gunpowder Plot, indeed, was worried about disorder. And what he did was, working with that other man that we've met, Robert Roth, he introduced a series of Acts of Parliament that were called the New Poor Laws. And I'll read you their names because they give us clues. Okay, so the relief of the parish poor was one act. The act to erect hospitals and working houses was another act. The act for the punishments of rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars was a third act. And they, together, these acts of parliament, instilled a system of correction in which overseers of the poor put the idle to work. And all of those new laws were amalgamated in the Poor Law of 1601. The laws required parishes to record, report, and detain economic migrants found wandering or loitering in their locale, the aim being to return them to their place of origin. So when we use the words economic migrants, another echo of the present. I mean, obviously these contexts are very different, but I would suggest that really the whole way we look at poor people now dates from this time. The whole way we divide people into the deserving and undeserving poor, whether we knowingly do it or not. What the tabloids might call the strivers, the people who need a hand up, and the skivers, the people who are just taking handouts. That's very much the thought behind these laws. And I'm going to refer to the social historian Andrew Wood here, who writes, quote, "The social force of Puritanism came from its validation of the growing gap between richer and poorer families, such that the people and the poor became distinct and opposed categories." So, you know, what effect is this going to have on the Sawyers in Edmonton? Well, it doesn't take that long for the results to become clear, because what is actually happening in very stressful conditions is that the parish is being divided up into good and bad families, and the Sawyers are increasingly seen as a bad lot. There are five appearances by members of the Sawyer family in about 7 years. The first appearance by Elizabeth was in 1615, when she was found guilty of stealing a sheet left by a neighbour to dry on a hedge. A neighbour had just had stretched the sheet over a wind bush for it to dry. Elizabeth, who had her last child that year, maybe she thought her need was greater than her neighbour's, she apparently took it, and she was found guilty for that. She was very lucky that the sheet was deemed to be worth less than a shilling, otherwise she would have faced the death penalty. As it was, she got 9 months in Clerkenwell prison. Okay. And then later, as things became more stressful and relationships deteriorated further, Elizabeth was indicted for witchcraft in 1621 after the argument with Agnes Radcliffe. And the interesting point about this, really, which goes back to what we were talking about, those Essex figures, is that Elizabeth nearly got off. Okay, trials in those days were very short; they're about 30 minutes, and she very likely would have got off, apart from an intervention by a justice of the peace from Tottenham, which is the parish south of Edmonton, a guy called Arthur Robinson, who intervened. And we know it was very last minute because they actually had to cast around outside the Old Bailey. They had to flag down women who were in the street passing by to get them to come in so that they could strip search Sawyer. And Arthur Robinson pointed the finger and said, you strip that woman down, you'll find the devil's mark on her. So these women were pulled in off the street. They stripped her down and they found some pimple or birthmark, or, I mean, if you stripped any of us down, you're going to find something, aren't you? And that really is what caused her to be hanged at Tyburn. And since we've been busy with maps, let's just make sure this works. Okay, so Elizabeth was hung on the 19th of April, 1621. And if we look at a map of Tottenham, which was produced 2 years before Elizabeth was hung, we will find Arthur Robinson's house. And there he is. He's got a very nice stately home and a farm. Okay, now I could stop the talk there and just do my readings, but I don't think we have a full appreciation of the situation that ordinary country women faced in the time of Elizabeth Sawyer. And you know, sometimes when you're doing research, you come across stuff which you have to puzzle out. You can't really understand what's going on. So to do that, if you'll indulge me, I want to investigate something that happened, which I've called the Pottersfield protest. It happened when Elizabeth Cromwell, as she then was, to use her maiden name, was just 17 years old. And we know that Elizabeth lived here in Winchmore. This is the Lord's Grove that we've been looking at. If we're just to walk along the parish boundary a few fields, we come to a place called Pottersfield. And Pottersfield was an area of common land. It is actually still an area of common land. The last time I went to it, it was a series of allotments, which is rather satisfying. But common land was constantly being enclosed by powerful people. Edmonton is very close to London, so if you can raise extra cattle or sheep or any form of cash crop, it's easy to make big profits. Right, to tell you what happened in the Pottersfield protest, I'm simply going to read from the court records. So I'm going to do that now. The Middlesex Session rolls from 1589 state that on the 7th of July at 10 a.m. at Joan Pottersfield in the parish of Enfield, County Middlesex, and it then lists 27 women, and there are no men there, it's all women. Alicia Ward, wife of Thomas Ward the butcher, Marjorie Hunsdon, wife of William Hunsdon the yeoman, Catherine Elborn, wife of John Elborn labourer. You can tell that these are all women who have very little means and depend upon common land really to survive the winter. The common land meant that you could if you had a cow, you could graze it there. If you were to grow peas and oats, you could grow it there. So these 27 women, I'm back to the court records here, assembled themselves riotously and in warlike manner, being armed with swords, daggers, staves, knives, and other weapons, and then and there maliciously injured and plucked up a certain fence of a certain close belonging to Alice Hayes, widow at Joan Potter's. Now, what is going on? Well, what is going on becomes very clear when the 27 women who end up in court for this offence send a petition to Lord Burghley. Remember, Lord Burghley, William Cecil, was the first person who was commissioning maps, the most powerful man in England. And this is in the British Library, and this is what they paid a lot of money to send to William Cecil. And it's basically an appeal over the head of the man who controlled the parish, Robert Wroth. And I summarised it for you here, but you can see that it's addressed to Burghley. This is on vellum. It would have been an expensive document to produce. And here we have a list of all the people who've taken common land in Potter's Field. So I've done a wee summary. Okay, so I've kept the old spelling in. To the right honourable the Lord Burghley, Lord High Treasurer of England. It says that divers gentlemen and others whose names are hereunder mentioned have enclosed to their own use the said field of ground. This enclosure hath late been pulled down and broken down by certain women inhabitants of the town, Enfield. Okay, so now this bit is surprising. This is the bit I didn't understand. The said women being great with child and looking to your honour to forbear may not go to prison. And then it lists who's stolen the land. Now these are very wealthy people. Mr. Wroth he's stolen 50 acres. Mr. Middlemore has stolen 10 acres. And Mistress Hayes has taken 8 acres. Now, 2 questions. Why are they going to Burghley? Well, that's kind of obvious. Wroth they're not going to complain to him. He's the one who's stolen most of the land. He's also the man who will judge the case in court. In fact, the 2 who have taken most land are the judges and will certainly send those women to Newgate Prison. So they send their appeal to Burghley instead. But why are so many of these women expecting children? And to find that out, really, I had to do quite a lot of research and ask around. But I was greatly helped when I discovered this following document, which was with the Burghley appeal in the London Library. And instead of being a beautifully scribed petition on vellum, this is a scratchy list of names with the smell of Newgate Prison on it. And when I held this list, it was a very bittersweet moment. I was standing in the British Library, there was absolute silence. I just held Goodcole's pamphlet in my hands, and now I had this. And this told the story of ordinary women activists who stood up for themselves. And so what do we find? We find a list of names of women. They're all referred to by their husbands. The husbands are not in prison. So Robert Spark, his wife, just means Mrs. Spark. Okay? And it says here, these women were with child and are brought to bed since. Okay, and you can see the women that are giving birth here. Okay, and then it says these 7 children did suck. So it means that 7 children have been born in Newgate Prison to heavily pregnant felons, and 7 of the children at least have survived. And what we see up here is Lord Burghley's writing, familiar to us from the maps. He writes by Robert Spark, his wife, or Mrs. Spark. He writes, she is brought to bed. So it's this kind of extraordinary document, and it tells us a lot about the status of ordinary landless women in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. This was 1589, so it's the year after the Armada. And I've kind of enlarged that for you with Burghley's writing. Why were the women pregnant? Well, they were pregnant because they were protecting themselves. So the way I've just read the court records, the way the court records read, it sounds as if there was a kind of pitched battle going on. But actually what was going on was a very kind of ritualized public demonstration of anger that these fences had been put up on their land and that the land had been stolen. The women didn't break down Roth's fence and they didn't break down Middlemore's fence. They chose instead the wealthy widow's fence, Agnes Hayes, and they would have assembled and there would have been comments and speeches, and then very ceremoniously they would have chopped down the fence because they knew what was coming. And the woman who chopped down the fence would have been one of the younger wives who was heavily pregnant. And the fact that she was heavily pregnant meant that she could not be hanged, because to hang her would mean to kill an innocent child in her womb. So that's how women who had nothing but knew their rights by ancient charter, that's how they defended themselves. And I think it gives us a real insight into how stark matters were and how vulnerable they were. So they were using this kind of loophole in the secular law called benefit of the belly, which was if you were pregnant, you couldn't be executed. It was actually quite unreliable. Sometimes they waited for the women to give birth and then they executed them anyway. So what can we conclude from this diversion, if you like, from Sawyer's story? I mean, she certainly would have known these women. There's no doubt about that. She would have known them from market, from chapel. They lived, a lot of them, less than a mile away. She would have certainly worked herself in Potter's Field, because all of those parishes in Edmonton are interlinked. Well, I think that the protest proves that local women in Edmonton were prepared to take direct action, particularly when they had a grievance against another woman. And indeed, this is what they did in Sawyer's case 30 years later. But it also shows the dilemma and vulnerability of women, of country girls and women in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. It gives us a greater insight. And I think that in a festival of talks, a program of talks, which is celebrating remarkable women, we should remember these 27 women who were listed, and we should remember Elizabeth Sawyer herself. Okay, so that's the end of my wee talk, and I'm going to read a couple of bits from my novel now. Okay, so here's the book, and you're very welcome to pick up a copy afterwards. I'm going to read two extracts. The two main characters in this book are Elizabeth Sawyer herself and Henry Goodcole, and really the book examines the last week of Sawyer's life when she was already in Newgate Prison. And the first extract is her talking to Goodcole, and it's kind of her confession. So you kind of have to picture me as Elizabeth Sawyer, or maybe just close your eyes might be a better idea. Okay, so she's speaking direct to Henry Goodcole. The first time the devil spoke to me, I was already with child. At Advent, having escaped Mistress Hayes in my parish, I had wed Edward Sawyer and moved to his village of Winchmore. Winchmore is across the bounds in Edmonton. Here it sits on the rising ground close to the Lord's Grove. The time of the devil's coming was in March, and all was frozen fast, for there was no end to winter that year. That first time the devil came at night, and he chose the shape of a fox. It was the week before Lady Day, and I awoke to the smell of sulphur, for his maw was close to mine, his breath hot on my face. The devil had red eyes, was silver as shekels in the moonlight, and had me pinioned to my cot. I wasn't fooled. I said, "Who let Satan into my bed?" The devil said, "You did." Hot coals watched me draw breath, claws pressed my ribs, and a silken tongue gave me a great lick. The dog fox tasted the salt off each pat and looked up when there was no milk there. Then he dug his snout lower to my belly. "You are with child, so now you must choose." "How so?" "I will either have your soul or that of your child. Tell me your choice when I return." With these words, the devil slipped off me and leapt into the night. For a while, I lay in fright. I could feel the chill east wind under the door and the warmth of Edward asleep in the bed beside me. Though my bump was slight, I placed my palm over it and swore an oath to my child. I'll have you blessed and baptized before that fiend can get near. Then I got up and cleansed each nipple with willow water. I did this to rid me of the brimstone spittle that burned there. Okay, so that is a kind of little look into Sawyer's world. And now we're going to hear about Henry Goodcole's world. And the context of this is that Henry Goodcole has just been to his printers, Butler and Son, where he has arranged the printing of his pamphlet. And Goodcole is an ambitious man, but a man with many doubts. Let's put it that way. So, after he had left Butler and Son, Goodcole walked the short distance up Ave Maria Lane to Stationers' Hall. The hall was a fine building marked out by its herringbone brick and tall Tudor chimneys. Entering up its curving stone steps, Goodcole greeted the sergeant and made his way up the oak staircase to the library. Here, all texts printed in the King's realm had to be noted down prior to production. A small queue had formed in front of the registrar, and Goodcole took his place behind a raffish character in riding boots and a cloak. Enthralled yet fearful of his surroundings, Goodcole looked around at the cabinets and dark panelling. The room was like the sacred space of a scriptorium, and it reminded him that he was now part of the eminent guild of writers. This not only meant that he was a success, someone to be reckoned with in this world, but it aligned him with the church. He basked in the glow of the thought as the man in front stepped forward to speak to the registrar. Name? I am William Rowley, sir. The man savoured his name as if it was a fine wine. Title of publication? All's Lost by Lust. 'Tis a tragicomedy to be played in the Phoenix, Drury Lane. It is a play in every sense, sir. Seriously funny, yet uncannily grave. Registrar shot him a weary look. Printer? Nicholas Oakes. I have the address. Goodcole listened to the exchange and steadied his nerve. With a scratch of a pen, the title of his next publication would be fixed for eternity. For a brief moment, he was tempted to play safe, but then wool fired in his veins and he decided to stick with his original choice. Name? Henry Goodcole. Title of publication? The Wonderful Discovery of Elizabeth Sawyer, a Witch late of Edmonton, her conviction and condemnation and death, together with the relation of the devil's access to her and their conference together. The registrar looked up. Must your titles be so long? They leave no space on the line. He tetchily scratched in the entry in full. Do you have a printer, sir? William Butler and Son. The registrar waved him away. I have the address, he said. On his way back to the prison, Goodcole mulled over his choice of title. It was in some ways a risk because the wonderful discovery could be interpreted in different ways. Goodcole's first intent had been to communicate the way divine providence had uncovered Sawyer's evil desires, but he was open to other interpretations too. Although she was a hard nut to crack, he had struck up an accord with her and was not completely against the woman. Illiterate and slovenly, she was also spirited and had a perceptive eye for detail. She had too benefited from his ministrations. Her new understanding of the power of the meek proved the point. Goodcole had no sooner congratulated himself than doubt clouded his thoughts, and a new question raised its head. What if Elizabeth Sawyer believed she was meek all along? Worse, what if she mistook the Saviour's comments about the rich man who struggled to enter the kingdom of heaven as some way of getting back at her betters? The thought put a chill through him, for this was the way dissenters saw the world. Drawing on notions of Passover in the Old Testament and Easter in the New, they foretold how, to right a great wrong, the innocents would rise up and topple the strong. Such talk was seditious because it aimed at nothing less than deposing the king and sweeping away the rule of the church. Goodcole stopped by our men's corner. He was about to turn on his heel when he checked himself. His title was already in the registrar's book, so there was now no way of changing it. He stared at the shop fronts and tried to steady himself. Surely a vindictive scold like that could not believe that she was meek and pure of heart. But 5 years in Ludgate had taught him that people were good at self-deception and saw faults in others long before they examined their own hearts. Besides, the true meaning of the word meek would be lost on Sawyer. Goodcull cursed his own stupidity. For words could prove fickle, and he should have chosen a title that was clear, not clever. Now, when he turned it over in his mind, the wonderful discovery of Elizabeth Sawyer smacked of something malign, a revelation of dark powers worthy of a witch. Okay. Right, well, that is the talk over with. And if anybody wants to ask a question, fire away. No pressure. I'm very happy if nobody does.
But I'd like to ask a question.
Yes.
I was asked about her trial and she nearly got off. So even
Yes.
though all the neighbours had heard her saying that, I remember that statement, and they were scared of her, that they nearly did vote her favour then.
It just depended whether people took the neighbours seriously. And that was always a man, and it was always an educated man of the law. And Elizabeth was unlucky that Arthur Robinson, for whatever his motivation, maybe he was trying to help parishioners, maybe, who knows, whether he was in good faith or not, but she was just unlucky. Now, the trial records for her trial have actually disappeared, but that's one of the really good bits of information we get from Goodcull. You don't pull in people off the street unless you really have to. They would have had that all organized in advance, because there was a long queue of people to be tried. I mean, I can think of a case of a woman from Enfield, a woman called Agnes Godfrey. So she was tried on pretty much the same charges. I mean, the argument was about a different thing, but her neighbours in Enfield sent her to the Old Bailey. It was within a month of when Elizabeth Sawyer was tried, and the judge threw it out. And then she was back. Her neighbours were furious. She was back another 10 years later. Again, the judge threw it out. A different judge just threw it out, and she outlived everybody in the end. She outlived her husband and probably most of the people who accused her. So it really did. Evidence by common law was admissible. So common law was reputation, you know, things people said you'd done, or things people felt about you, but it wasn't crucial evidence. And it's that intervention. I mean, it's really interesting why Cecil didn't overturn the sentences of those women who Robert Roth had sent to Newgate for breaking down a fence. Well, he had very good reasons not to, because he was working with Roth in Parliament. So he might be very happy to contain him in a local context. And actually, there was all sorts of stuff going on the River Lee. It was pretty much a low-level civil war going on with Robert Roth on one side and Cecil on the other. But he was not going to enrage Robert Roth. He needed, after all, Robert Roth later worked with Cecil's son on the Poor Laws. They're the two people who are responsible for all of those acts of Parliament. So you could see that those women were kind of collateral damage in that respect. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned ethics.
Yes.
Why is there such a thing?
Well, it seems that it suited certain, basically there's a tradition of witch hunting in Essex. So men not only acted in the courts to convict women, they went from village to village. So, and I mean, who knows what they did, but that's why it just, they're going out and just picking on people and hauling them into court. And that seems to be a particular thing that happened in Essex. And that's why they may have, but it didn't. If you're a witch finder and you come to a village and you ask a few people, who knows who's going to be condemned? You know, it is a lottery, really. If you ask some of my neighbours about me, they I should be careful. Some of them are here today. Anyway, so yeah, it was a lottery. I think that's the thing. But Essex is particularly bad, 3 times worse than Middlesex. But there were a lot of cases of witchcraft in Middlesex too. And I don't know if I've got time to show you this. There are a lot of men practicing witchcraft in Middlesex. So I wonder if I can do this. I don't think I'd have time to show you this. Okay, so this is a Tudor police report. It's you can see state papers. And it's a letter to Robert Cecil, who is head of Elizabeth's, Queen Elizabeth's surveillance state, and it's dated 1590. And I mean, you're not going to read that, but I'll summarize it for you. And the really interesting thing about this is that this incident, which was basically a hot pursuit of two men across Enfield Chase, the constables had a bloodhound, so it was like really something from today would be a cop thriller, wouldn't it? But it was, it happened very close to where Elizabeth Sawyer lived. So this is the village of Winchmore. Remember, I showed you, this is a kind of close-up of the map I showed you. There's the field the Leake family name. And it happened in that, at the top right, at Hughes Close. And, okay, so I mean, I'm going to kind of summarize for you. But basically, what we have here is the constables who chase two men across the field because they've heard about satanic practices going on in Hughes Close. And they discover a full-on kind of, they arrest one of the men gets away, and they drag him to a great tree where all sorts of paraphernalia are found. Circles have been drawn around the tree, a cock has been sacrificed and its blood sprinkled about. There's a crystal with the word Satan written on it. I mean, you couldn't really make it up. It would have been very tempting for me to kind of put this in the book. But, you know, I didn't, as it happens, because I wanted to stay with Sawyer. And then, astonishingly, the man who is arrested with all of this evidence, a man who has a picture, upside down picture of Jesus on him and serpents on his arms, he's let go and trusted to appear at the county session. So he's kind of bailed, which is very, very different from those women who were sent to Newgate Prison, who went the extra mile to send that petition to Lord Burleigh. So it's kind of just a jaw-dropping, really. And I didn't know whether I'd be able to drop that in, but thank you for your question. I thought it might just confuse things, to be honest. Lovely. Any more questions? Yes.
What made you want to present this story in the form of a novel rather than a biography or non-fiction? Did you ever think of doing that?
Yeah, I did. I wanted Sawyer's world to live. And in my novel, Sawyer is a storyteller. And the basic, I mean, I'm just one in a list of men who put words into her mouth, basically, including the playwrights. That's why I took 5 years to research the story. But this story started with my thought process was this. You're lying semi-naked in a prison cell in Newgate Prison in solitary confinement. You have been condemned to death. A man comes in to take your confession. How do you turn the tables on him? Well, the only way that I worked out doing it was through storytelling. And Sawyer's confession is as much a story. And whether you believe it or not is up to you. And you kind of have to read the book to find that out. But to me, that was the only way that she could truly retain her sense of self. Because there's almost no words in Goodcole's pamphlet that we can trust by Sawyer. The only bit that I could trust was the bit about the argument with the neighbour where she says, that'll be a dear blow to you. That's the only bit. I kind of heard Sawyer's voice when I read that. But the rest, which is presented as an interview, is really just Goodcole putting words into Sawyer's mouth. And the reason he's doing it is to curry favour with the church. And actually, after he published his pamphlet, he got a promotion and the chapel at Newgate was redone. So it worked very nicely for him. So it was really that idea of how can she retain her sense of self when she's been downcast so low. And the first part of the book are her stories, and you've heard just a tiny snippet of one of them. And those stories reverberate through the entire novel. So I don't want to kind of give things away, but that was it really. That confrontation between them, that sense of how do you turn the tables on a man who has already decided what you've done. Okay, yeah. Any more questions?
Can I ask just one more?
Sure, yeah.
It's probably written on the spot of it, but in terms of sort of now, bringing it forward,
Yeah.
do you think there's any parallels in the way of sort of women's experiences? And, you know,
Well, I'm not the one to ask really about that. I'm sure there's plenty here who'd give you an answer. Yeah. I don't know. Well, I think when people use the word witch, no two people mean quite the same thing. I think there's loads of parallels, but I don't be the one who lays them out. I think it's for everybody to see those echoes. The contexts are different. People thought in very biblical terms, but if you were to go to parts of America where the evangelical right are on social media a lot, the devil is being invoked a great deal. And that's where I would see parallels. This idea that you're either with us or you're against us, this kind of, it started by calling people groomers and all of this, and it's just turned into, you're in league with there's all sorts of conspiracy theories out there. But I mean, I'm not going to go onto those websites, but they're full of stuff about the devil. And once, that figure of the devil in post-Reformation England was really, really powerful. One of the issues might be, so when the Bible was translated, which was an extraordinary thing because it led to an amazing growth in literacy. And if we go to London at the time Elizabeth Sawyer dies, there are women publishing pamphlets, really kick-ass feminist pamphlets that just, they speak in biblical terms, but they're astonishing. If you go to the English Civil War, there are women like Anna Trapnell who speak truth to power in a way that is so moving. But if I'm in danger of losing my thread here, but in fact, I have lost my thread. So that was pretty stupid. I veered onto these pamphlets. Yeah, so thank you, Kate, that's lovely. So the translation of the Bible destroyed the line between the sacred and the profane. And so then there's this tremendous anxiety when particularly women are using words that are in the Bible, but maybe corrupting those words that are in the Bible. It is, that you're never far from the subject of gender with this research. It's women shut down, even if they were practicing some sort of herbalism or whatever, were being shut down and the parallels now probably the same thing. I think absolutely people were being shut down. May not be called witchcraft now, but there's other reasons that are being used to make women be quiet. I think so. And there were people making their own reputations about accusing other people, That it's odd, because the print revolution, which is happening in London, a Good Cause pamphlet is just part of that print revolution. It's kind of like the internet of its day. And there is just this massive stuff coming out, sort of pamphlet wars happening. And it's fascinating. And that's why I'm fascinated when women started publishing pamphlets too. Some of those pamphlets, by the way, sold so well that men then pretended to be women and wrote pamphlets, pretending they were women, just to sell. Right? So you have to be careful with some of them. But it's a really fascinating topic. What interested me was the situation of country women who are often illiterate in the parishes. And I hope if you get one thing from this sort of looking at the research, you get a sense of both their bravery and the sense of jeopardy that they experienced. And that's still trying to do that. It's activism, isn't it? Yeah. It's really inspiring, and no, it's inspiring. And we have a lot of fantastic activists in Belfast, so I take inspiration from them too. Okay, right. So, any more questions?
Just really quickly.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Just interested in your thoughts on why you think
witchcraft and witch hunting has kind of this fascination with it, has persisted right from, you know, the Jacobean era right up until Arthur Miller, the Crucible. You know, I teach literature, and my students, you give them a choice between any other text and anything to do with witchcraft. Like, witchcraft, you know, what is it about it? Do you think, as a historian and an author, that just captures people's?
I don't know. It's a heck of a charge to point at somebody. I think what interests me is the scapegoating side of it. But I think if you asked everybody, there's a bit in us. It's the bit we don't know. You know, I mean, somebody was telling me about one of their tutors who started their session at Queen's with how many of you students believe in witchcraft, and there was a few people put their hands up, and then she said, well, how many of you would cut down a fairy tree? And most put their hand up. She said, well, you believe in witchcraft. I mean, it's not quite the same. You know, fairies in Ireland are a very different thing from these very sort of Protestant accusations of, because it's always linked to the devil in some way. I don't know, I felt personally, you know, I'd lived in Edmonton and I'd worked with local women in Edmonton, and, you know, my daughter Elizabeth was born in Edmonton, and I just wanted to know more about these women, and I got a lot more than I bargained for when I started reading. And it took me, like, that idea of benefit of the belly, just, it's not really talked about it, you know, benefit of the clergy, where if you could say one of the Psalms and were literate, you could get off literally with murder. That's probably where the expression getting away with murder comes from. But this benefit of the belly thing was really new to me. And the very fact that we don't know about that is, it in itself tells its own story, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So, you know, I just don't understand how we're actually saying the devil came to you. It's not in the table.
Well, you have to read the book. You have to read the book. So, and you can decide at the end whether you think she really has turned the tables. You know, that's really for the reader to decide, isn't it? It's just my attempt. You know, it's my attempt. But no, it was a fascinating book to write. Took many drafts. I was very lucky to have Glenn Patterson to kind of bounce off when I was writing it, and Ramona Ray, who's a wonderful person at Queen's, wonderful student of early modern literature. So yeah, it was. You have to make up your own mind. Buy a copy.